Hello and welcome to another episode of Django Chat, a weekly podcast on the Django web framework. I'm Will Vincent, joined by Carlton Gibson. Hi, Carlton.
Hello, Will.
And this week we are very pleased to be joined by Mikey Ariel to talk about technical writing. Hi, Mikey.
Hi, Carlton, Will.
Hello, Mikey.
So we were just discussing off air, you wear a number of hats. What are you doing today in terms of helping developers write better technical docs?
So the first thing I do is actually write technical docs. So I'm a senior technical writer at Red Hat, and I work on OpenStack platform. And the other thing, the main thing that I do is I'm also on the core operations team, global core operations team at Write the Docs. So we organize conferences, meetups. We have online spaces for anyone who cares about documentation, content, communication, and so on, mainly in the software industry.
And can you tell me a little bit about Write the Docs? Because that came out of Read the Docs. And can you tell me the history and the relationship there?
Yes, of course. So the co-founder of Write the Docs is also the co-founder of Read the Docs. So Eric Holscher is the person who started basically both with a few other people as well. And now he's involved with both. So we're both on the core operations team of Write the Docs, but he is still running Read the Docs with a different team. So he basically has two projects or ventures.
The other thing that Eric came up with was the famous Pac-Man rule, right, at conferences.
Absolutely. And I love the Pac-Man rule. This is one of the traditions we have at Write the Docs, which I'm a big fan of. And I think it's something that can be very useful to any communities, any places where you have conferences or a bunch of people who don't know each other who get together.
Yeah, so we do that.
Do you want me to run down through it a bit?
We do that. Yeah, you can tell us all about it, but we do that at DjangoCon too, and it's one of the things that I find really cool because it just opens up. But yeah, tell us in case listeners don't know what the Pac-Man rule is.
Okay. That's great to hear that you're doing it in Django conferences as well. Pac-Man rule is basically a social helper where if you're standing in a group with, 2 or 3 more people, you should always leave some of the circle open for someone to join in. And so your circle ends up looking a little bit like a Pac-Man. And it's basically giving people explicit permission to approach groups, join conversations, and to also accept new members into a group or a conversation. So it's basically saying you can do this and don't be afraid to join a group and meet new people.
Yeah, and it really works well. So that's cool.
So I want to ask about your background, Mikey, but before that, what are the standard paths to get into a technical writing role? Or are there standard? Because I could see someone coming from writing and then learning some programming to do technical writing, or maybe a programmer who decides they like writing more, though that's maybe less common. How does one get into technical writing?
Well, it's funny you should say that because up until recent years, there hasn't really been a standard path to technical writing. I guess I can compare it a little bit to what's going on nowadays with data science, because a lot of people come into data science from programming, from statistics, from math, from science, from all different kinds. But there's nobody's really teaching it in the universities. There's no degree in data science yet, unless somebody came up with it. But as far as I know, it hasn't come up yet. And so technical writing for a long time was kind of like that, even though it's quite an relatively old profession. As soon as developers realize that they have to document what they're coding, then somebody had to come up and do it. So there have been technical writers. Yeah, there have been technical writers since the 60s or 70s. I actually met a few of them. Somebody gave a talk about the history of tech writing, and it used to be binders that you use whiteout and take out a page and put it back. It was awful. But generally, up until recent years, if you wanted to be a tech writer, there hasn't really been a strict university program. Somebody might learn a technical writing course as part of computer science degrees. But what actually happens is people who are drawn to the tech industry, but who have a strong linguistic background, a lot of tech journalists, people who studied English, people who were doing, I've met people who've basically retrained as technical writers, and I've done the same thing because before I was working in tech writing, I was working in television.
Right.
I was doing production management. I was doing video editing. I I was working all kinds of administrative things around the broadcast industry, which was another passion of mine. But I basically went by the route of a private sort of placement company that they basically outsource contractors for tech writers. And they offered an internship combined with a course. So I did 20 hours a week for 4 months at a tech company. So that was my internship. And then I also did 1 day a week of classes, and the course was free. And then they got a free intern, and that's how I got my first job.
Wow.
So that was a little bit how it worked back then. Yeah. Yeah. So there are a lot of ways to get into technical writing. I think the best combination is to have a technical talent, so to know your way around technology, and to have a really strong linguistic, grammatical skill,
Yeah.
because that's the part that really makes the difference between, let's say, a technical writer and a developer, right? Because we deal with words.
Right.
That's the main thing.
Well, but you also said something really quite controversial, was that we have to document our code. Like you kind of implied that was true.
It's so, yeah, Carlton's is so clean, it documents itself.
No. I'm joking.
Self-documented code is code you wrote recently.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite controversial things to say.
Or code you wrote today, even.
Yeah. Well, I think that in general, it's not necessarily. See, that's the thing, right? There are different types of documentation, and documenting your code is not necessarily, putting in help strings on every single function that you write. Although that could be useful for other developers who are, let's say, using your API or things like that. But if you're looking at the end goal of any software development is to have somebody use the software, right? So unless you have such a simple tool, and you're working with people who have the same background, I mean, a specific background, just because they're developers doesn't necessarily mean they'll understand what you made. Ultimately, you have to explain what the goal of your code is, your software. What can the user achieve with it, and why should they even use it, and how to use it. So those are all things that should be documented, even if you don't document every single function in detail.
Well, like any piece of code, you go to, you find a repo on Hacker News, you click through, you end up on GitHub. You need a decent introduction, right? You need a decent Git README, or you need a tutorial or getting started or something.
Exactly. You need to find a way to capture the attention of today's modern, impatient, and smart user, right? And if your users are developers, you still look at them as users because they use what you've made. And so it's a part of your selling point is to have a good hook. And that's where technical writing, even though it's technical writing, it's still a very big part, and should be a very big part of the marketing strategy for your software product.
Right. Well, marketing's another thing that I think developers are famously bad at. So
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say they're bad at it. They're just not experienced, right? They didn't specialize in it. This is one of the things that I always try to diffuse a bit of anxiety or resistance when I talk to some developers, because they say, "Oh, I'm terrible at documenting. I'll never do it."
Right. It's like the equivalent of like, I'm not technical.
Exactly. I mean, I had zero experience with Linux before I joined Red Hat in 2013. I was working as a technical writer for mainly Java, and before that, C#. But I used IDEs for all my doc strings, and I never really worked in a terminal, but I had a good foundation as a technical writer, and I had the open-mindedness to learn new things. And now my default operating system is Fedora. I never thought I'd be there, and I always thought I was not very technical. So, I mean, it's just like, but the reason I mention this anxiety or resistance is that a lot of times developers forget that they specialized in a different skill set. And so it's okay to not be an expert in documenting your code. But if you can learn, if you want to learn, that's the thing, right? There are different ways, different levels of expertise that you can get to. For example, I choose not to really learn how to code because I was never really as drawn to it as much as I was to technical writing. And that's not to say that I don't have the most respect and awe from people who can code really complicated and amazing things. That's great. That is just not my field of expertise, and I choose to focus on tech writing because I like it more.
Right.
Well, how would
Go on, Will, carry on.
I wanted to ask you maybe a meta question that I think a lot about since I wear both hats of writing and programming, and that is, what's the difference between a documentation and tutorials, or do you think there's a distinction? And I'll tee that up in the context of, so with Django has fantastic documentation, but I've seen more and more that showing how a tiny piece works is different from showing how to use it in a larger context, or perhaps providing advice, which is more, basically what I write is tutorials. And it took me a long time to understand why the Django docs and other docs weren't tutorials, but now with experience, I see that each has its place, but that's, I think, a distinction that takes some time to internalize. I'm curious if that resonates with you.
Yes, and that's actually something that has been going on in the industry for quite a long time. I think I've been a technical writer for 10 years, and maybe a few years after I started, there came a huge wave of basically shifting the focus or reprioritizing the types of documentation that you provide. And this is something that we still struggle till this day. I mean, this is not absolutely, we didn't solve this problem. So just as a side note, and because I'm a writer, I'm going to say this, documentation as a term, it is usually referring to all types of documentation. So what you're specifically talking about is reference documentation, right? But Django project treats it like the documentation. So it's actually misclassified, or the term is not the most accurate.
Well, I have to come to our defense there. We do have topics and tutorials and reference in different sections, and there's the how-tos, and there have been historical attempts to break this divide. But I think Will does make a valid point: is that the Django docs can be a little hard.
Yes, I've tried many times. I think every time I run a doc sprint at a Django event, I refresh my knowledge of the Django docs structure, and every time I'm like, oh right, I remember this, because I always say, if I'm new and I want to get started, I get lost within about 5 or 10 minutes.
There's just so much of it.
Yeah.
I know. But this is, that's the thing, and about trying to restructure things, and that's information architecture, and that's a whole other can of worms. The point, to answer your question, tutorials are an essential part of documentation, right? Especially if you have a big project with a lot of moving parts, and especially if it's easy to get lost in the references and the concept topics, right? So one of the main things, for example, at Red Hat that we're doing is we're implementing use case based or story based documentation, which is not exactly like tutorials, but it does serve a similar purpose, where the procedure, or the how do I use this software to achieve a goal or to solve a problem. And that's where the procedure-based, tutorial-based, end-to-end user story-based, whatever you want to call it, the idea behind it is basically the same. I don't want to know what all the buttons in the cockpit do. Just tell me how to fly this plane.
Right. Well, and I think, I like that section of your talk from DjangoCon this year, which we'll link to, where you had that picture of the plane cockpit.
I will give credit again. This is from the director of content services, started using it in his presentations when he tried to explain to the powers that be why we need more tech writers and better infrastructure. So this is definitely, I didn't make this up, but I definitely use it, and I got permission from him to use it everywhere because I think it's a great analogy.
Right. Well, I think what's one thing I'm thinking about is, as someone who writes about programming for a living, is the other piece is I'm trying more and more to, maybe it's part of use case, but to personalize my things so that I'm launching a dedicated Django site. And one of the first things I'm going to do is ask, are you a total beginner? Are you new to Django but have experience with web development? Basically mimic what I would do in person, where I just want to understand where the person is at. And from there, I can customize, because I realize that I can do that. If I ask one or two questions up front, I can just have a dramatically better experience for someone. But the problem with most tutorials is that the person writing it is basically writing it for themselves, and they're assuming a level of knowledge. And if it's a 10-page thing, one page in, if you miss a thing, you're just gone. And so it's all about the assumptions.
Right.
Anyways, maybe that ties into the use base, but sort of knowing what the background is of the reader helps a lot, because a total beginner needs something different. And most documentation that I see is not written for beginners, which is why, and probably rightly so, whether it's these billion-dollar companies, they have tutorials, but they presume a level of knowledge that most or a lot of people don't have. But I guess ultimately they're not the customers, which is why these billion-dollar startups, people ask me to write their docs for these companies, and I'm like, why is that? And it's like, oh, I think they just don't care about those people.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right, and I see this in smaller projects, but the problem is bigger in the like you said, the heavyweight sort of doc set and the heavyweight solutions. I mean, for example, Red Hat is a beast,
Yeah.
and we have like dozens of products. Each one of them is complicated on its own, and then most of our customers basically buy subscriptions for multiple products. And I mean, we're at the level where for a lot of things you really do need a consultant or a solution architect, and they actually write a lot of their own docs, and we leverage them back into the doc set, but that's a different thing. I think that what you're describing is quite a common challenge. And one of the things that I talk about in my presentation, and also when I do some coaching, is figure out your persona. Who are you writing for? And it might not even be a matter of beginner or advanced, because, for example, I wouldn't necessarily, you can make a certain set of assumptions, but even if, for example, you're writing something for administrators, something for operators, something for, people who are, I don't know, sysadmins, all sorts of different people and roles who have a different foundation might approach your documentation looking for different things. So are you planning, I'm just curious, are you planning to do some kind of dynamic serving of docs based on those questions that people answer? Because that's something we're actually looking into at Red Hat and a lot of other things, where you have almost like a wizard, or you do checkboxes. You're saying, which products do I use? What's my knowledge level? What's my role in the company? And then boom, you get
Right.
a tagged set of topics, which is really cool in theory, but a little bit hard to implement.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, Carlton. Yeah, I mean, I'm doing exactly that. I mean, so by the time this airs, I'm having a site, learndjango.com, that's just dedicated to Django. And I think it's going to be more that I realize, like, I already have 50 tutorials. And when I one-on-one talk to people, I suggest certain things, but I don't do that to someone who just comes to my site now. So I don't know. So, it'll be dynamic in the sense that I'll ask one or two questions and then point you on a roadmap that makes sense.
That's great. And if you can do it in a way, for example, because one of the things that I found really frustrating was if I go to the Django docs page and I say, I want to start, what's the first tutorial or the first concept that I need to know? And you end up actually getting into like this clicking rabbit hole that very quickly derails you from the path. So if you're saying you have 50 tutorials, it might be even something to consider is to chunk them according to stages, as far as like learning curve is concerned. So someone is an absolute beginner, you say you do this tutorial first and then these 3 tutorials. So like actually really hold their hand more than what I find a lot of projects are doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. exactly what I'm doing, which, I mean, partly, I mean, this is being done in the, the email space. Everything is about personalization, and it makes sense, right? I mean, why just have one set of things for everyone? So yeah, that should be out in some form by the time this airs. So that's a
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and
project of mine.
I think in general this also indicates um, the whole difference between tutorials or use case based documentation and, let's say, the rest of the documentation, which is mainly concepts and reference. Right? Concepts means
Mm.
why do you use this software, and references mean every single doc string or API references and things like that. And the thing about procedure based or use case based documentation is it should be opinionated, and that's something that open source technology in general, and I've seen this in Django and Python and JS and a lot of different projects, because a lot of the open source projects are documented by engineers who are used to working on specific components, and they have a little bit of blinders, so it's not like everybody works on their own piece. Maybe there's an architect or a manager who oversees the big picture, but if everybody only documents their things, then you're going to end up with a lot of specific reference documentation, but you're going to see all the options, but they're not going to tell you which ones to use inside an end-to-end scenario where you want to deploy something. So it's a matter of like taking it one abstraction layer above and then figuring out, yes, this API can do anything you want, but which ones should I choose? That's the opinionated part of documentation that I think is missing from a lot of open source projects. And it's not necessarily because people don't care or they're doing it maliciously. It's just it requires a different set of skills to determine this as well, and to talk to your users. Like you're saying, you're consulting, you're asking these one or two questions in person, and then you're going to port it over to your website to do it automatically, which is
Yeah.
already a great step that a lot of open source projects could use.
What's more work, I think, is the issue. I mean, it's that's what I see more and more.
The automation question is always, is it worth maintaining a system where you dynamically build documentation based on the specific Snowflake use case of whoever's
But
reading
you don't
it?
need to do that. You can have like a questionnaire that leads to a series of bucketed landing pages. So if you are an absolute novice, then here's 5 places to start. If you are an advanced beginner, well, here's 5 different ones. That's not too hard to maintain, surely.
No, it's not, and I think it's not too extreme. I think any extreme in this sense is probably not a great idea. And the tricky part, but I think the most useful part, is to try and balance. If you're saying, I want to be more opinionated and give you more specific documentation, there's only so much you can go. There's only so far you can go, because even, for example, at Red Hat, we have, we're trying to be more opinionated, but we have to look at for example, the top 3 use cases, right? We can't document every single corner case. And that's something that we also need to give credit and trust in our users. So, for example, if we say we recommend that you do things in this way, there's nothing stopping you from, adding a few links of saying there are a couple other ways to do it if you don't like this or if it doesn't work for you. You can't predict everyone's specific use case, but you can try and work towards compiling learning resources, right? Because that's basically what documentation is to help you learn how to use the software. And so you should figure out, how do you want people to use your software, and try to direct them to that. Or if they want to learn how to code and they want to become contributors, then there's a different learning path for that as well. And they should focus on different content.
Yeah, it does. It does. I'm sitting here thinking, I'm just sort of listening to the two of you talk and thinking about how all this relates to the Django project, because we have a mass of docs and, for instance, a contributor guide that's like 6,000 words long, and people find that quite intimidating, and people find, people come to the homepage and the homepage isn't that clear on what, exactly as you said, you've got to click around a bit to find even the tutorials. Yeah, and then I'm thinking about the contributors. I'm thinking, well, you're right. These are different skills, and we have lots of people coding up stuff on the ORM, but they're not necessarily the best equipped to, improve the docs, and it's just a massive challenge. I think
Yes, it's a big project, and the bigger the project gets, the harder it is to chunk information in a way um, that it won't get over compartmentalized, right? Because that's kind of what happens with a lot of big projects. So you're not alone in this. And I don't know, Carlton, if you might be able to, you might want to edit this out if I'm not supposed to talk about it. But we did have a conversation
yes.
with Russell about getting some help from the documentation side to the Django project.
Yes, no, I mean, and this is something.
I don't know if we should talk about
well,
this.
this is something that's I think is a really good idea. We've got fellows. I think we can talk about this. I think this is just an idea, and it's a good idea. But we've got a couple of fellows who we work on ticket triage, and we work on all sorts of things. I wonder if it would be possible, and it may. I've got to check about the DSF's non-profit status and all the rest, because there are limits on what you can do. For instance, Maris and I, we're not contracted to code on Django. We're contracted to work as community managers almost, to manage the issue track and resolve issues like that and do the releases. But coding isn't something which a non-profit is allowed to pay for, because software development doesn't fit according to US tax laws, which is fair enough. So I need to check about the writing. But one idea was, could we get a docs fellow? Does the DSF have capacity to bring someone in, maybe part-time or full-time, to work on the docs? Because we have these kind of information architecture issues that we've talked about, but also we've got over 1,000 docs tickets that, it's not that they're necessarily that hard per se, but they need love and care and attention, and somebody with, the written English skills, because a lot of our contributors' English isn't even their first language. So,
But sometimes they're better writers, I've found.
Oh yeah, no, like there are some there are plenty of contributors whose first language isn't English, who have better English than I do by a country mile. But
can I tell you a secret?
Yeah.
English is not my first language.
Well, that's because you're.
It's
Really?
It's almost. I'm from Israel.
Yeah.
So I grew up with English at home because my father spent some time in the States when he was young. And then when I was 16, we moved to California. So I lived there for 5 years. But English is almost my first language. It's just a very close runner-up. But there is actually an advantage, just a side segue. There is an advantage sometimes at learning English as a second language, because by the time I got to the States, I actually wrote better essays than some of my native-born classmates, because you study it much more structured way.
Yeah.
So
about
in
it.
a much more formal and structured way. But I want to comment a little bit about the Docs Fellow idea, because I think you ask about the Django project specifically, and this is something I kind of try to plant the seeds as we go along. I think looking at the documentation and looking at the ticketing system, the challenge is bigger than just getting drive-by contributors. And I think Django project could really use, even as a short-term contract. I mean, if I was in a different place in life, and I would, for example, be able to dedicate myself to doing the information architecture, tackling, and figuring out how to triage, doc tickets and stuff. It might be enough to just get someone for a few months
Yeah.
as a contractor to just say, here's our documentation set. Please knock yourself out. Give us a proposal on how to restructure it, clean it up. And it's better if you get someone who's not directly involved, for example, with coding, or someone who has a bit more of an objective perspective
Yes.
and is not emotionally attached to what you've done until now. So that might be something to consider there. And I think it's, for some projects, the problem gets too big to tackle, with volunteers.
Yeah.
And that's something Russell also talks about. Skills cost money, just like you would need to pay a lawyer or a community manager to do things that are not software development. I mean, if you can get, approval for a docs fellow, I think it would be really beneficial, because you can get a lot done in a short amount of time. And then they can also set some contribution guidelines, content to help people, future people. They might even be able to do training, webinars or presentations, or write tutorials on how to get the basics, for your contributors. Anything you can do to help people on board onto the project would be useful.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good idea, and obviously what happened after DjangoCon Europe is we talked about it, and then the day-to-day took over, and it's been on the back burner. But I think there's obviously the ORM and the admin, which are big issues in Django. But then the next group of open tickets we have is documentation tickets, and exactly as you talked about, the front page isn't great, and I see it as just a massive.
Well, I think it's okay. It's okay.
It's okay. No, I mean, look, don't get me wrong.
The thing is about the document.
The loads of effort's gone in. It's all good stuff, but the reality is we find that there is barriers to participation. We have people who I just couldn't get started contributing. It's like, but it's not that hard.
Yes, because it's there's a difference between making the front page look nice, but once you start getting in, I mean, it's still a beast. And it's very easy to get lost, not because necessarily something is written badly. It's just the project really is that big. And a lot of people I've met in the Django community who remember what it was like when things started, it's almost like it's hard to believe that the project is so big that new people can get lost. And that is a factor of psychology that a lot of projects don't realize is a factor. And this is part of the justification, I say, or something like that, to bring in a fresh perspective. Because if you're getting someone someone who's an expert in their field giving an opinion or analyzing where you are at, they don't have all the history in their heads, right? And I mean, a lot of projects that I do consulting for, they say, oh, we started out, we just had a README, 6 months later, we have 50 topics and we don't know how to organize them. And, even just that kind of jump, can be disorienting. And a lot of people will just say, well, I just don't want to look at it. I'm just going to hope the problem will go away. But documentation is not going to organize itself. And I don't know what the state, I don't know what the state of the doc tickets is at the moment, but the last time when I was in DjangoCon, I had a chat with somebody about it, and they said the problem is that a lot of those documentation tickets are actually not low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
So you can have, let's say, one ticket, but it hides inside a really big feature or a whole section of the project, so it could theoretically imply that the ticket management itself could use a fresh look. Because, for example, I don't remember if you break down coding tickets in according to epics or stories or something like that. Like if you have a big feature, do you create sub tickets or subtasks, for the different components? This might be something that documentation tickets can benefit from.
Yes.
Because you can say, oh, document the ORM, right? That's a huge thing.
Yeah, it's not possible, is
to
it?
put in one ticket, So it could be that people are looking at those tickets and they might be not written in a helpful way. It could just be, document this thing, and it doesn't actually have a kind of breakdown of what needs to be documented. It could be that the tickets are hiding inside really big tasks, and it's worth breaking them down.
I think most of it is that it's at this stage, because Django's very mature and because the features are mature, and for instance the ORM is mature. If there's a documentation issue on the ORM, it's not that something's not documented. The issue is that it's this really particular use case which needs to be clarified in the documentation, and it requires quite a high level of understanding in order to be able to resolve that ticket, because you've got to really understand the code, and then you've got to have the ability to phrase it in the clearest English. And
are you sure that you really have to understand the code? Because I'll tell you why I'm asking.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the advantages of for example, me being a tech writer but not being a coder is, again, I'm not emotionally attached to the code itself. And especially if you're talking about a specific use case that needs to be documented, it usually involves more than one component. And it usually involves having to like use multiple things in order to achieve a goal. And it requires a different style of thinking.
Yeah.
So the fact that I can't write code, I learned how to read code enough, just enough to understand what I'm looking at, um, which helps me. But I also communicate and actually have conversations with the engineers if I need to. I work from specs. I work from a lot of different types of information. And if you're looking at a doc ticket that requests to document something specific, then maybe it's better if you are not an expert in, or that you didn't write this specific component or something like that.
Yeah, well, I think there's really something to that, because I was going to ask you, Mikey, how do you deal with you maintaining your empathy for the first time, or for who you're writing for, right? When, like with Red Hat, you are much more aware of Red Hat itself than you were a couple of years ago, and therefore I think it's hard to have that same beginner's mindset about it. But perhaps when you don't day-to-day code, you maintain that more, because certainly I have that challenge with Django, right? As my own comfort changes,
Yes, it's your comfort
I have to work
zone,
harder
right?
to.
So you remember
Yeah.
when people arrive at your documentation set, or when people arrived at your software project, they are not in their comfort zone. They're
No.
learning. So even if they're very comfortable in something else, then then they're starting out from a different place. And I think that even though I am more Linux savvy and more Python savvy, because OpenStack is written in Python, and I think that the fact that I've maintained a little bit of a distance from the code itself allows me to keep that fresh perspective. And specifically in OpenStack, but actually in a lot of our products, um, there's so many components. I'm actually not even in charge of documenting the whole set of OpenStack components. I'm only in charge of certain product areas. For example, in my case, it's the virtual compute and high availability. Somebody else in our writing team is in charge of networking. Somebody else is in charge of storage. So, and there's always something new happening. So almost every feature or user story that I document that comes in, I'm learning it from scratch. So I'm getting introduced to it from a fresh perspective. And so that kind of helps me keep a little bit of that big picture in mind, but not get so far in the weeds that I lose track of that.
Yeah.
What and how do you? So this is a question I have. How do you avoid writing just like a recipe list for something, or maybe that's fine professionally for you? Like when I'm writing a book, the challenge for me is to not just say do this, do this, do this, do this, and then predict. Some in person people make mistakes. There's a back and forth, but in writing, I want to let the person know that I'm with them. Like you probably make this mistake here and there, but it ultimately is a bit of a this. And so maybe the writer in me kind of gets frustrated with that format. Is that something you think about, or is it fine to just have like a recipe list for a particular feature?
I'm going to use the classic answer of it depends.
Hey,
That's the tagline
welcome
of
to
our
Django
podcast.
Chat.
Oh, is that really?
Yeah, every
Well,
episode.
we always try to be opinionated, but some things it does
But
depend.
it depends. So here's the thing. When I first started learning tech writing, I got a great piece of advice where you have to keep the language level at fourth grade level American English, right? So present simple, keep
I
the
don't do that.
sentence structure super simple. So this is advice that I got for working on enterprise documentation.
No,
Okay.
I believe the advice. Yeah.
Yeah. So the concepts and the subject that you're describing in your documentation is already pretty complicated. So what I try to keep in mind is to make the language flow as simple as possible
Yeah.
so that people won't get disoriented by being too verbose. That being said, the reason I said it depends is because some, um, for example, if you take the Django Girls tutorial, okay, which is a
Hmm.
beautiful example of very sweet and has fluffy language and it's personal. It uses a lot of really positive superlatives. Why? Because it is meant to help women take their first step into the great unknown of programming.
Yeah.
And these are people who have a lot of anxiety, people who need to have that personal tone. Okay, so if you're talking about the tone of the documentation, for the most part, in the bigger, enterprisey or software projects that are aimed at, let's say, the general tech population, okay, developers, administrators, things like that, you should consider your audience. They don't need to have, fluffy confirmation bubbles about everything. And for example, if you're talking about a procedure, you say, you know, this should be the output if the process was successful. If you get this error, or if you get an error, this is how to troubleshoot it. So the information can still be there, but most of the time it's better to keep the language as dry as possible, especially for the bigger documentation sets, because, for example, in OpenStack, we have 12 writers,
Right.
and the whole documentation set should read like it was written by the same person. So we have style guides, and we try to keep the language as clean as possible. It also helps prepare for translation, because
Yeah.
the easier it is to read linguistically, the easier it is to translate. But I wouldn't need to do that, for example, in the Django Girls tutorial, because I want to be fluffy. I want to be happy. I want to get people at ease, and I'm using a more personal tone to achieve that goal. So,
Right. I like that. Well, and part of it too is I mean, I joke with some of my friends, happy path programming, where you just say, if you like go watch a video tutorial and someone just, if I make no mistakes, I can do something complicated quite quickly, but it doesn't. Yeah, having those asides, which you sort of referenced, are important to, aside from tone, to say, here are probably some common mistakes you will make, and don't, just don't become discouraged if you make them, because you're going to make them because I made them writing this tutorial, and presumably I know something.
right. And I think as for independent folks or people who are involved with open source projects, when you write tutorials, especially for beginners, there's definitely space for positive reinforcements and validation. And for example, what we do, sometimes we'll say, instead of saying, you might have this problem, if so, here's to troubleshoot, we can say, make sure you put in this variable in this format, otherwise it's going to fail. So we try to kind of help them get the
Hmm.
foundation as they go. And sometimes you'll have a procedure where every other step has a note, saying make sure to do it
Yeah.
like this. I'm not sure if that's the best way to do it like that, but there are different ways to kind of try to channel the user towards the right path.
Hmm.
On the other hand, I have to say that, and I think I talk about this in my talk, because sometimes people don't believe you and they'll try to use your software out of scope. And
Yeah.
then when it breaks, then they're saying, oh, okay, well, I should have done what they actually said.
Well, Carlton, it's like our kids, right? I try to stifle the urge to say I told you so, but I'm definitely thinking it when stuff like that happens.
Well, I mean, children will be children. That's fine.
Right. You have to, you can't, I can tell you the right way to do it and what mistakes you will make, but until you do it, which you will, you won't hear me. And then you'll say,
I don't know what your
and then
kids are like, but mine are very much like, because you told me, I'm doing it the other way.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. Well, it comes in phases. Yeah. The defiance comes in waves. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
I know
Well,
a few adults who are like that as well. It's not just the kids'
Right, one or
domain.
two.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I know we're sort of coming up on time. One thing, my last question, then Carlton, I feel like I've dominated the discussion, is I wanted to ask you about opinions versus best practices. And maybe this is, so if there is a Django fellow on writing, it's probably hard for Django itself to do that. But for me, with my writing, I see more and more the patterns in Django, for example. Carlton and I had a podcast on how does it feel when you work with something for a while, you see the patterns. And so, for example, I always try to call out, this is something, there's these splits in the road, so project structure, there's, a couple ways to do it. I will say, you just need to pick one and it doesn't really matter. Or if there is something where there is, I think, a best practice, I will say, here are the 3 ways people do it, and this is why I advocate for this one. But kind of have these call outs of like, you'll see it done different ways, and either it matters or it doesn't matter. That's something that I think a lot about. It'd be interesting. I don't know if you could do that in the docs, right, Carlton, to say, like, for example, like the docs say you should use a custom user model, but it buries that. Maybe it should say that up front, whereas should you have a period after start project or not? Well, and even custom user model, it's like, well, you could have the user profile, right? It's not like, where is the space for the discussion, which is really what this podcast is about, is having the discussion rather than just a list of things.
That makes sense. And it's a good question to ask, because that's kind of throwing back to the when I was talking about balance between being too specific and too broad. So,
Yeah.
for example, if you have a fork in the road, where does the road begin and where does it end, right? Because if you're structuring, for example, a project in Django, there's a lot of different components and they all need to work together in different ways. Do you do something out of the box, or do you use, let's say, a custom, or do you customize the component, right? So this could be something that you can direct them within a tutorial, or you want to think about the end goal, because it's very rare that you just have one fork in the road. And
it's a choose your own adventure. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So how do you help people choose their own adventure, right? Although in choose your own adventure books, the ending is usually, there's only like maybe one or a few different endings you can have. This is a big question. I mean, it's a big question, and I think that so some solutions I've seen, for example, actually recently worked on some topic where we did an installation procedure that was divided to a few subsections, right? So you have, like the undercloud, the overcloud, and then the guest instances, which is how the stack is compiled. So we said, if you're doing a fresh install, do everything on this topic from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
And then before we even started going into the procedures, we said, if you are starting from a pre-deployed undercloud, which is the foundation, you can skip these and go straight to here. So
Right.
so you can have, it depends on what you're trying to achieve, but sometimes it's good to have everything documented from start to finish, and then say you can skip this. But it's usually better, and I'm going to give this advice in general, whenever a user opens a documentation topic, whether it's in the web browser, I'm thinking it's a web browser, because that's how usually things go. It's usually better to have things self-contained, instead of, for example, if you get to step 2 and then you're saying, well, there are 2 options of doing this. You can either do option A or option B, and every option, for example, is a link to a different, that's dangerous, because as soon as you're sending them away from the topic, then you're making it much harder for them to keep the context of the full procedure. So I think before you even look at the forks in the road, see what the end goal should be. And if you want them to get to that goal, you're going to need to figure out how to explain things in a way that's self-contained within that, let's say, tutorial or procedure. Yeah. And it might be better to break it down to multiple procedures, depending on how common the use case is, right?
Or give an opinionated route, and then but in sort of side boxes say, oh, and you could do this at this point, but come back to that.
Exactly. So,
that's what I do. I do that as an aside. Yeah.
As the person who's creating the documentation, you are already considered the expert from the reader's perspective. So what you might think is an opinion, they see as a best practice. So that's something that you need to keep in mind.
It's kind of scary,
and
right?
Saying, well, it is with great power comes great responsibility. That's something that we need to keep in mind, because, for example, when we document things it means we support them, right? So if you're documenting how to do something and you recommend people how to do something, you should consider the fact that they'll actually do what you suggest. And
Yeah.
so you want to make sure that if they do that, they get to where they want to go.
Yeah, I think I like the, as we said, the um, addressing something, but maybe saying, as an aside, or you could do this, but I'm not going to get into it, and providing an opinion. So, I think one of the best teachers I ever had was actually for accounting in business school. He would answer every single question people asked, but this was a class of like beginners and CPAs, but he would say, this is relevant to what we're talking about, or it is not, right? So you could turn your brain on and off instead of becoming overwhelmed. And so I think of that in terms of writing, of like, I might mention these things, but this isn't the time or space to get into it, which is, I think, the point you were making.
Exactly. So, telling users which information they need to focus on at this point
Right,
is
curating it, yeah.
crucial to the process, especially if you're talking about such a big project like Django. I want to achieve a certain goal using Django software, tools. Just give me, it's just barely good enough, just barely documented enough for what I need to achieve. You can have links and sections, for example, at the end, or maybe as a note saying, if you want to read more about this or dive into it more, go to this topic. But you need to explain it very clearly that this is not necessary, right? It's an optional or an alternative to what I'm giving you right now. So people can choose whether or not they click that link and go to another topic and get a bunch of reference information or concept information. Because a concept information, for example, can be, why would I go to this part, this fork, or this fork, right? And so you need to assume that if people are doing the procedure, either they've already made that decision or they're not aware of that, but they trust you to tell them what's the most recommended way to achieve this goal. But you can also give them side links and make sure that it doesn't distract them from what they're actually trying to do.
Yeah, well, I think, Carlton, when you were a consultant, I found when I was consulting, the challenge of something like this is someone will say, I want to achieve X, and you say, okay, I suggest this, I suggest Y based on all my experience. And then if they want to get into the weeds, it's like, well, okay, we could really get into that, but that's like a novel when I just gave you the, the synopsis.
No, there's one thing I found with like people, clients who'd be hiring you, you have the expertise, you'd be there to build the thing, and they'd ask for a solution. So they define the problem, right? They're the client. They tell you what you've got to build. And then you come in as the quote unquote expert, and then they say, oh, but why aren't you using this? Or why aren't you implementing it this way? It's like, no, don't give me implementation details. That's what you're paying me for.
Well,
Right,
exactly.
right.
And this is something that I can also see that is very relevant to documentation, because you're basically coming in as the expert. And especially if you're doing tutorials, it's very similar to solution-based documentation, right? Which is, how do I use all these different components to solve my problem? And so if you're, looking at it in the similar way that you would look at a consulting engagement, just think that you're consulting to the most common use cases. So let's say you have 100 customers instead of just one, and they all want to achieve roughly the same goal. So there's nothing there. You shouldn't worry about appearing, trying to get people not to get distracted into the weeds.
Yeah, no, and in fact, you're doing them a disservice by overcomplicating the story.
Yes. Well, let's just say that it's very rarely a tools problem, right? And that's the psychological part that I keep mentioning when people ask me this, is you got to talk to people, you got to communicate, and they have to communicate with you, So for example, somebody says, I just want to know how to use this. You need to say, that's not specific enough, Or if people are saying, why don't you use this, this component or that solution, if they want to get into the implementation details, a lot of times you might find that uh, easing their mind about the details might help them accept or adopt the overall solution that you're proposing.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of times they just want, in that particular circumstance, they just want you to justify your choice, so that they know to trust you. That's totally.
Which is
Yeah,
fine.
yeah,
I mean, that's a
absolutely.
conversation that needs to
Yeah,
happen. And as
absolutely.
long as they're not being malicious or especially trolly about it, then you should be able to do that. I mean, when I interview engineers about documentation, I'm always, asking them questions to possibly that, and sometimes it happens that we uncover gaps in what they've initially explained to me that they thought was enough. But if I'm pretending to be a first time user, asking all the annoying questions, it helps to bounce those ideas off of another person and get feedback, right? So it's the basic concept of feedback. You propose a solution, whether it's with documentation or in your consulting engagement, or in your workshop that you give at a conference. And it is expected and encouraged that people will not necessarily challenge, but try to understand. And everybody learns in different ways. So people might ask you different questions.
Exactly. So I did, talking of workshops, I did getting contributed to Django Sprint at DjangoCon US this year. And, we'd got this getting started guide, but going through it with 40 people, we found, all the issues. It was amazing because having this massive group there going through it, they were of questioning the steps, and they were hitting the errors, and it was, we got a good list of improvements. It was super.
Which is great. I mean, when you're taking me back now to my first Django Girls workshop, the first one that was at EuroPython 2014, and because they made the tutorial, and then they ran the workshop with the first set of 45 participants. And at the end of the workshop, during the workshop, of course, we discovered all the bugs in the tutorial. And so naturally, being a tech writer, I said, hey, why don't we do a doc sprint, during the sprints at the end of the conference and fix the tutorial? So we actually got the Django Girls participants who just made their first website ever to also make their first documentation contributions ever. So I don't know if you will have a chance to do that, but maybe that's also an exercise that can really help. If you create a new set of docs, especially tutorials, if you get people to test them and then help you fix them and make them better, it also means you don't have to do it alone.
That's something
and
I'd really
if you
like
kind
to
of
do.
engage the first time users in feedback in an active way, so they can actually submit the ticket and make a pull request, because the idea is fresh still in their heads because they've just done this tutorial, right? So that could be a nice exercise for them.
And there's something so good about the Django Girls process. They put workshops and they're putting so many people through it. And yet there seems to, what I'd really like is some way of engaging some of those and getting them contributing to open source or joining in open source projects in some way. Because it feels like there's a big gap between what's next, what's after that.
Yes. Well, in the beginning, I remember we had some trouble because a lot of people were lost afterwards, and they were like, well, I don't know what to do with this newfound knowledge. But slowly over the years, and what I like is happening right now is a lot of companies are actually collaborating with Django Girls Project to hire out junior level engineers or programmers from the alumni. So the secret was to collaborate with open source companies, outsourcing companies, whatever companies, consulting, to be able to continue the training. And that's, again, it's a human factor and it's collaboration. But I think getting people to practice is probably the most helpful thing. There's no substitute for, we say stage time in theater, or you can say flight hours,
Right. Well, I think it's guided practice, right, is what really is what people need when they're starting out. And I mean,
structured practice, maybe not
right, which is hard to
be there with them, but give them feedback iteration.
Right. Or even just do this next. I mean, like, so this site, which would be learndjango.com, I mean, being not wedded to the book format, it will have, for example, like, use Django to build a clone of 5 different popular apps, where they can see everything is CRUD, but until you've built, your Facebook, your Instagram, your Twitter clone, you don't see that. But then it's like, oh, now I have these clones or deep dives. I think that's the challenge is, like the Django admin, there's so many things you could do, but like I'm going to have a deep dive where it's like, let's just have a project and let's just blasted out with all the things we could do, that's to me easier than reading all the docs, which is more of a table of contents rather than a guide.
Sorry, I keep cutting you off. I get excited.
I'm the same way. I mean, Carlton barely gets a word in this podcast, so I can empathize.
Yeah, and I totally get it. And it's something that's really useful. And one of the things we try to do, for example, at Red Hat is really give a lot of code examples, give a lot of as close to real life implementations as possible. Because if you get people practicing doing the thing rather than learning about how the thing works, then they'll get more practice at actually building something. And one of the great things, with Django Girls, for example, is it takes you really from the ground up. You learn Git, you learn how to, structure your folders, you learn how to set up your sync with the remote, with a hosting server, like all the, even installing Python is something, dependencies, all these different things that, if I just read about Python or Django, I would really get lost before I even knew what to do first.
Totally agree. Carlton, is there anything you want to add as we head out?
Again, just thinking about all that's been said I always get really blown away whenever I talk to Mikey. It's just like, because this is, do you remember the literate programming thing? Donald Knuth had this idea that you could write this beautiful book and code and programming in this and executable code in the same thing, in the same artifact.
Yeah, it's a lovely dream.
Yeah, but you're asking people to be the world's best programmers and the world's best writers at the same time, and it's just not the reality that we're in. So for me,
exactly.
But in the Django community, hang on,
is actually collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. And in the Django community, we got all these people who do fit that exact profile that you've talked about. They might be English majors, or they might be, wordsmiths or whatever. They just happen to be using Django as well. And it's like, for me as the Django fellow, it's like, how can I lay the breadcrumbs out to entice those people to come and join in?
Exactly. In a similar way that you have the Django fellow, they take care of triaging, release management, all of that sort of project architecture thing, which actually enables the programmers to do their jobs because they don't have to think about it. So in a similar way, for example, we can have a content strategist, or even a program manager, or whatever you want to call it, a fellow, information architect, that's just naming things is hard, but the function of that person will be to give, to enable writing contributions to come in more easily.
Yeah.
Because they can prioritize the tickets. They can break down big monster tickets to sub-tickets. They can decide together with, the body of people who decide which features are coming in, to also decide which features should be documented. So it's kind of like having a product manager for documentation.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of the roles from the engineering world, from the programming world, can be and are actually ported over to the writing world. And so if you have all these wonderful linguistically inclined people, but they're not information architects, right? So if you give them a task to write something, they can do it. But how do they decide which ones to take?
Yeah.
What's more important? How far should I document this? Should I just do it an overview? Should I get really deep into it? These are all things that you can't expect the programmers to decide these things. This is something that needs to be a community, maybe consensus based, or however you make the decisions about what to code can also apply to making decisions on what to write.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. Yeah, as I say, blown away.
Well, once I get that merch shop set up for Django, which Django Girls has done a good job of, then we can maybe make it easier to fund that position.
Great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. So your personal site is Dockside of the Moon. Is there anything else you want to call out if folks want to get in touch with you?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy that we could do this. I'm always happy to geek out about docs, and I do love the Django project. So I'm really happy that we get to do this. docksideofthemoon.com, or you can follow me on Twitter. I am that docs lady on Twitter, GitHub, and IRC Freenode. And please follow Write the Docs. We have conferences in Portland, Oregon, in Prague, in the Czech Republic, where I live, in Australia. We're also looking to do an East Coast conference next year. All of our conferences are small enough to have a lot of Pac-Mans, and we have a lot of meetups. We have a Slack team, and we're just a really friendly community, and we welcome people from all roles. So if you're a writer, if you're a developer, if you're a community manager, if you're a designer, if you're a librarian, support engineer, we love everyone. And we do believe in collaboration. So if you're a developer, you don't have to retrain as a technical writer to create documentation. You just have to find the right people to work with.
Super. Well, thank you, Mikey. That was just amazing to have you on.
Okay, wonderful. Have a great one,
All right,
guys.
take care.